Hello and welcome to News Central TV. I am Adebola Adeduba, and here are stories making the headlines beyond the continent. The news begins in North America, where a man fatally stabbed two women at a university in the western Mexico city of Guadalajara. The assailant was described as a man around 20 years old. He burst onto the campus of the Central University, Uteng, carrying a knife and a hatchet, which he used to smash several windows, said Luis Joaquin Mendez, prosecutor for Jalisco State. A man was also wounded during the attack. Police have arrested the assailant and are also investigating his links to another woman who was found dead in a hotel on the same day.
El sujeto quebrando los cristales, amedrentando y amenazando a la gente y desgraciadamente, bueno, al llegar al área de recepción donde queda la primera persona sin vida, la ataca sin mediar palabra, nada. Al ingreso de la recepción hay una persona del sexo femenino, desafortunadamente occisa, es empleada administrativa. Se localiza a otra mujer, también empleada administrativa de aquí de la escuela, o formaba parte de una especie de grupo de WhatsApp o de aplicaciones en internet en donde se meten a compartir historias y a buscar historias precisamente de crímenes por fanatismo.
Now to the Middle East, 8 family members of Israeli hostages held by Hamas in Gaza held a press conference in Israel's embassy in London. The Israeli-Hamas conflict, which has already reached its 6th month, hopes for a ceasefire before Ramadan have failed. According to a health ministry in the famine-threatened zone controlled by Hamas on Thursday, the health ministry said 83 more people had been killed over the previous day, adding to a toll it says has reached 30,800, mostly women and children, in a war that China called a disgrace to civilization.
Look at us. Look at them. All the time. Keep them in the top of the agenda. Keep them in the top of everything. They must come home now. Immediately now. We want them alive, and we also need the ones that are not alive anymore. Everyone got to return home, and they don't have time to wait.
How I miss him. I miss the coffee we used to drink together. I miss our arguments in our daily conversations. What a big crisis our life had. Our life come to halt. You know, soon we are celebrating Passover in Israel, the holiday of freedom. And we're leaving a chair to Elijah, the prophet. I want my son to sit with us. Come join us, and bring the miracle.
A Hamas delegation has left talks in Cairo without a deal for a ceasefire in Gaza, but the armed group says indirect negotiations with Israel are not over. It had been hoped that a 40-day truce could be in place for the start of the Islamic month of Ramadan next week. With more signs of a famine looming, international pressure has only grown. Egyptian and Qatari mediators have struggled to seal a deal that would see Hamas free Israeli hostages in exchange for Palestinians held in Israeli jails. Israel did not send a delegation to Cairo, saying it first wanted a list of surviving hostages who could be released under the agreement. And to give us more detail on the story, we're joined live on the news by our international correspondent, Afua Hagan. Good evening from here. It's a pleasure to have you join me, Afua.
Good evening.
Now, what's been the reaction from either side at the end of the talks with no deal?
Well, these peace talks have been going on for a number of weeks now, with the aim of perhaps avoiding an assault on Rafah, which could start, like you said, at the beginning of Ramadan, which is due to start on Sunday evening. Now, Hamas left the talks in Cairo, saying they left for consultation with the leadership of the movement, with negotiations and efforts continuing to stop the aggression, return the displaced, and bring in relief aid to our people. A senior source has said that negotiations would resume next week. Now, Israel weren't at those talks in Cairo, so there's been no official comment from them. Now, the US State Department has said that they believe that the obstacles that are getting in the way of a peace deal being reached are not insurmountable, and a deal can be reached. Now, this proposed agreement would see 40 Israeli hostages exchanged for about 400 Palestinian prisoners being freed from Israeli jails. There's about 130 hostages that were taken from Israel on October 7th, still being held by Hamas and their affiliate groups. This 40-day truce would also mean that aid could get into the country. At the moment, we need about 500 trucks of aid going into Gaza, and at the moment, they're only getting 90 trucks of aid, and aid so desperately needed in this part of the world. These peace talks are over for today, but it's thought that they could resume, even if it's after this kind of pseudo deadline of the start of Ramadan on Sunday.
Now, talking about Ramadan on Sunday, I'm wondering, Afua, what does this mean for the assault on Rafah?
Well, the holy month of Ramadan is always quite a volatile time in this region. And it was said that Israel wanted to start its assault in Rafah, home to usually about 250,000 people, now has about 2.5 million people in that area because of the assault on the rest of the country. Everyone has fled to this area. It's almost like they have been penned in. Now, as far as we know, this assault on Rafah is still scheduled to go ahead, but it's thought that the humanitarian cost of going ahead with this assault on Rafah could mean perhaps 1 million people dying, and most of those people, in fact, will be women and children. They are the ones that have seen the highest casualty numbers in the 30,000, well over 30,000 people now that have died in Gaza. 25,000 of those, this was last week, were estimated to be women and children. And so if this assault on Rafah goes ahead, it will exacerbate the humanitarian disaster which is already occurring in that area. Like I said, a city that's usually home to about 250,000 people has 10 times that many people packed into it. At the moment, with the aid, a fifth or less of what they need, lack of shelter, lack of food, exposure, all these things mean that it could be catastrophic for the people that are in that area.
Well, like you rightly mentioned, Afua, talking about deaths and starvation from these issues in Gaza, I'm wondering what are your thoughts on what needs to be done going forward to help get aid into Gaza?
And that's a really good question. It's all about making sure that you have the right groups on the ground, whether that's from the UN or from the World Food Programme, that have the links to be able to get into Gaza, but also distribute the aid to the places where it's needed. Last week we had an attack on an aid convoy where about 100 people died. They were fired on by Israeli soldiers, but also some of those people got caught under the wheels of the trucks and were run over because people are so desperate for that aid that they will put themselves in harm's way. Like I said, we need 500 trucks a day going into Gaza with aid. And that aid is not just food, it's water, it's medicines, it's also things like canvas and shelter and cooking supplies that people need. Only 90 trucks a day are getting into Gaza. Now, people are already dying of starvation. About 20 children have died of starvation in the past week. That's according to the the Hamas-run health ministry, but also you have pregnant women who are due to give birth, are giving birth early because of the stress of the situation they're in. And of course, you have babies that are going to be dying from starvation because there's no formula available, or the mothers themselves are not able to feed them. Starvation is a real issue, and it's one that is going to become more prominent as the humanitarian crisis grows in Gaza. 20 doesn't sound like a big number, but anybody dying of starvation, one, is far too many. And this number is set to grow. If this assault on Rafah goes ahead, we will certainly see these numbers grow. And especially as aid has been stopped getting into that area as well, it's creating a perfect storm for famine in Gaza.
Well, Afua, I'm tempted to ask you, what needs, to be done? What more needs to be done? Do we need more pressure? Do we need more international organizations intervening, or to ensuring that a truce is achieved?
Well, you do have quite a number of international actors already at play, on this stage, so to speak. You had talks in Paris where you had Qatar were involved, as well as Egypt. You had the United States as well. You do have a lot of different actors involved, different countries coming to the table and trying to bring these two sides together to form some sort of ceasefire or truce, whether it's temporary or whether it is permanent. But I think that at this stage, Israel are really determined that they are going to wipe out Hamas. They want complete destruction of Hamas. And it seems that they're prepared to do that any which way possible. And it also seems that on the ground in Gaza, you have millions and millions of people who are now thought to just be collateral damage. And so trying to get rid of Hamas, trying to have the total destruction of Hamas is leading to this humanitarian crisis now, unless you have more interventions, like perhaps we've had at the United Nations, the UN Security Council, which Israel will pretty much ignore, if they're brought to the ICJ, or whether there's resolutions at the UN, they will continue their bombardment. I think there really has to be a reason for them to have a ceasefire. Now, if their aim is to bring the hostages home, as well as have the complete destruction of Hamas, you might have to do one to get the other. So you might have to have a ceasefire so you can get some hostages home, and so that you can maybe have some conversations about why actually you don't need to go ahead with this. People in Israel whose relatives are still missing are determined that their relatives should come home, that should be the aim of the war, that should be the aim of the action. But that isn't what seems to be happening. You've also got the point that Hamas may not know actually where all their hostages are. When they were brought into Gaza and the areas around, you also have different forces, Palestinian Liberation Force, Hezbollah, who they're also working with, that might have some of those hostages too. So that may be another reason why this is being delayed, because Hamas are trying to round up the Israeli hostages that they want to swap.
Well, Afua, we will definitely keep in touch with you for any development on this story. Thank you so much for your time on the news. Afua Hagen, our international correspondent right there, live in London, UK. Thank you once again.
Thank you.
You're watching Beyond the Continent. Let's take a short break. Stay with us. Thank you for staying tuned. In Europe, Spanish Foreign Minister José Manuel Alvarez says Spain will send the United Nations Palestinian Refugee Agency, UNRWA, an additional 20 million euros in aid. And this will be on top of the 3.5 million euros the country has already pledged in February. Spain was not among the donor countries that have frozen funding to the UN agency amid evidence and documentation provided by Israel that some of its staff participated directly in the Hamas October 7 massacre and others have ties to terror operatives.
Como le acabo de anunciar al comisionado general de UNRWA y les anuncio ahora a ustedes, desde la AECID realizaremos una nueva contribución de 20 millones de euros a UNRWA para apoyar a la organización en su crucial labor humanitaria en Gaza y para atender las necesidades alimentarias, educativas y sanitarias de los casi 6 millones de refugiados palestinos en la región. También, como hemos hecho durante muchas semanas nos oponemos a que la Unión Europea dejase de entregar la ayuda humanitaria a UNRWA y por eso nos congratula el saber que la Unión Europea va a hacer un primer pago de 50 millones de euros.
The United Nations Telecoms Agency chief, Darren Bogdan Martin, warns of the toll artificial intelligence could take on societies, but says her greatest concern remains the huge number of people without access to digital technologies. She also expresses concern over the lack of women in science and technology, as she urged women to join the field.
2.6 billion people today are not connected. They've never, ever connected to the internet. And this is really one of the biggest challenges of our generation. And it comes at a time of both hope and also uncertainty. Uncertainty because emerging technologies like artificial intelligence can be used to erode trust in our elections, in our institutions, and it can threaten our jobs, our privacy, and I think also our very future. My biggest fear and what keeps me up at night is the 2.6 billion people that are not connected. And I say that because if you're not part of the digital world, then you're not part of the AI world. And I do think we have to close that gap. But today it's everywhere, and I think it's for good reason, because there are incredible opportunities that we can leverage from AI in general, from generative AI. But there are risks, and we need to be able to manage and mitigate the risks.
The head of the European Commission, EC, Ursula von der Leyen, is running for a second term, and her candidacy has the support of the European People's Party, EPP, the largest party in the EU Parliament and a conservative. The former Minister of Defense is requesting a new mandate that would last until 2029. As the President of the European Commission since 2019, he has managed several crises, including the COVID-19 pandemic and the conflict in Ukraine. Von der Leyen requires the support of the EU Parliament in order to be renamed to the position, and the EPP's approval is crucial. At the party meeting in Bucharest, 400 EPP delegates voted in favor of von der Leyen, and 89 voted against it.
Things right together in the last 5 years. The track record shows that Europe has stood its ground under most difficult circumstances, and we have laid the foundation for a successful future. Now we must tackle the stages ahead of us with full concentration and with unity, and this is why I'm running for another term at the helm of the European Commission. But what is not acceptable is that migrants that are not in need, not eligible for asylum, are being brought by smugglers and traffickers under incredible circumstances to the European Union. Therefore, I was and am very clear that it is us who decide.
The European Central Bank is freezing interest rates again, holding off from starting to cut, as President Christine Lagarde says officials were not yet sufficiently confident on progress towards the bank's inflation goal. After the ECB launched an unprecedented campaign of monetary tightening to tame runaway consumer prices, Eurozone inflation has been slowly steady from a peak of over 10% in late 2022. The stock market rose on both sides of the Atlantic, and gold hit a new record on Thursday, as both the European and US central banks indicated interest rate cuts could be on the way later this year. The European Central Bank, as expected, kept its rates unchanged for a fourth straight meeting on Thursday, but the Frankfurt-based institution lowered its inflation forecast, expecting consumer prices to increase more slowly than previously throughout this year and return to its 2% target in 2025.
The risks to economic growth remain tilted to the downside. Growth could be lower if the effects of monetary policy turn out stronger than expected. A weaker world economy or a further slowdown in global trade would also weigh on euro area growth. Russia's unjustified war against Ukraine and the tragic conflict in the Middle East are major sources of geopolitical risk. This may result in firms and households becoming less confident about the future and global trade being disrupted. At the same time, there are signs that growth in wages is starting to moderate. In addition, profits are absorbing part of the rising labor costs, which reduces the inflationary effects.
Hundreds of tractors have disrupted traffic in Prague's historic center as farmers gather for a rally against the government, slamming austerity and red tape. In the latest of a wave of farmers' rallies staged across Europe, protesters are calling on the government to support rural employment and drop austerity measures, including taxes on EU subsidies. They also complained about high production costs, excessive red tape, EU environmental laws, and grain imports from Ukraine. Thousands of farmers have also rallied in neighboring Poland on Wednesday, slamming EU regulations and cheap imports from Ukraine.
Nám zadržují nerovnoměrné podmínky, ať je to Evropská unie, že jo. Když se koukneme na Německo vlastně a Francie mají větší dotace než my, že jo, Polsko, Česko, Slovensko, jako... Furt tady to existuje, jak to bylo rozděleno dřív, že jo. Když si vezmeme, že tady bylo Rusko, že jo, a tam byl Západ, že jo. Nás jenom využívají, my kvalitní potraviny odvážíme vlastně do Německa, do Francie, a k nám se vozí ty špatný, že jo.
In sports, French public sector workers are set to go on strike during the July-August Paris Olympics, and that's according to the Secretary General of the powerful CGT union, Sophie Binet. Reports say that CGT will file formal strike notices next month. Medical and social professionals, as well as employees of both municipal and federal government, would be covered by the strike notice. The announcement comes after Tony Nstangue, the head of the Paris Olympics Organizing Committee, called for a social truce devoid of strikes last month. Rather, Binet asked that the topic be discussed in a meeting with Prime Minister Gabriel Attal.
Écoutez, oui, mais ce que nous voulons, c'est justement, nous voulons que le gouvernement prenne les mesures immédiatement pour assurer la réussite des Jeux à laquelle la CGT travaille depuis des années. Pour cela, il faut enfin que nos alertes soient entendues et que les Jeux soient préparés d'un point de vue social.
Donc là, ça monte d'un cran la pression sur le gouvernement ?
Mais oui, parce que ça fait des mois...
And that's all on Beyond the Continent. Send your eyewitness report to the WhatsApp number on the screen and follow us on social media. We are at News Central TV. You can watch us live on DSTV, channel 422, Star Times, channel 274, Avo TV, and YouTube. Many thanks for watching. I am Adebola Adeduba.